Welcome everybody to our webinar on the 2020 US elections, the view from the Korean Peninsula. My name is John Nielsen-Wright. I'm Career Fellow here at Chatham House and Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia and Senior Lecturer at Cambridge University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very timely webinar with our focus really understanding how the Korean Peninsula is adapting to the results, such as they are, of the recent election in the United States. Let me begin by just making a few sort of announcements about house rules for the 45 minutes that we have. This meeting will be on the record. It will not be under the Chatham House rule. If you have questions during the webinar, please make use of the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking questions during the presentations, and I will make sure that as many of those questions can be raised to our two speakers. Just one or two other things to mention. This is going to be about 45 minutes or so. Our presenters are going to speak very briefly for about 5 to 10 minutes each. Let me begin just by introducing our two distinguished speakers. Kathy Stevens, who served as US Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011. And as you will have seen from her biography, considerable experience having served in Washington in the State Department and the White House in a variety of policy positions, and is currently President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute, a position she's occupied since 2018, and is joining us from Washington, DC. And secondly, John Delury, an old friend, Professor of Chinese Studies at Yonsei University, where he also serves as chair of the Program in International Cooperation, a very prolific commentator on Korean affairs. I'm sure you will have followed both his tweets and his numerous articles and commentary on the state of North-South relations and more broadly on relations between China and the Korean Peninsula. It is, as I said, a very important time. We have an election result, even though the current president, of course, is still vehemently refusing to accept the legitimacy of the result. But I think the expectations are now that with a transition eventually going to take place by next January, some of the expectations about the thaw in US-North Korean relations that Donald Trump, in a sense, was partly instrumental for as a result of some of those important summit meetings, is now going to be replaced by a more conventional approach on the part of the incoming Biden administration, with some speculation that a President Biden will revert to the playbook of the previous Obama administration, what's often referred to as strategic patience 2.0. It will be interesting to see whether, in fact, that is the case. But with the prospect of a return to more conventional alliance politics between Seoul and Washington, this raises interesting questions about how Seoul and Washington will coordinate in dealing with the challenge of the DPRK. In all of this, of course, one of the critical questions is how the administration of President Moon in South Korea, which has played such an important part in acting as a catalyst for improved relations between the DPRK and the United States, will pursue its own policies in the brief amount of time that remains to the incumbent president in South Korea. And of course, this question has broader implications for regional security, given the very real and present danger that North Korea continues to present, with the general acceptance that North Korea, of course, remains a de facto nuclear power with perhaps as many as 40 or perhaps as many as 60 nuclear devices, with a lot of concern about the danger of provocation, particularly at this difficult time in the few months that remain before President Biden takes office. The very fact that Donald Trump has been so reluctant to hand over power and to recognize the legitimacy of the election is raising real concerns about the preparedness of the United States. But those are really questions about US policy. The focus for our discussion is primarily the view from Seoul and also the view from Pyongyang. So let me start by inviting Ambassador Stevens to kick off our discussion with a few words of introduction. Ambassador Stevens, the floor is yours.
John, Professor Nielsen Wright, thank you very much. It's lovely to join you. It's still early morning here in Washington, D.C., but it's great to see both you, John, in Cambridge, and my good friend John Delury in Seoul. I am mindful that I'm not on the Korean Peninsula right now. I'm in Washington, but I think I'll just make some brief comments that will try to give you a sense of what I'm hearing and thinking about, the view from, especially from Seoul, and perhaps Professor Delury can talk a little bit about the North Korean angle. These are obviously connected. One thing I would say, just as a way of just context, and I think everyone who's probably tuned into this call knows this, US elections have always been followed very closely in many countries, but in my experience, especially in the Republic of Korea, given the role the United States has played there over the years, I personally have been in Seoul for 4 different presidential elections, and I'm not going to go through all those. The first one I was there for was 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected on a promise of withdrawing all troops from South Korea because of South Korea's human rights record. So I just say that to give a sense that, and that was a shock. That was a big shock. I remember then, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, how worried people were about that. And I was actually in Korea in 2016 when the surprise Trump victory really caught the South Koreans, I think, as it did the world, flat-footed. This year has obviously been a very different year. A couple of observations maybe about the Trump administration, again, in terms of context on the US-South Korean alliance. I mean, it comes as no surprise to our friends in Europe that Trump is a skeptic about alliances. He made that very clear in his relations with South Korea. I've been struck by of the many, many kind of tell-all books or tell-some books that are already out about the Trump administration, the 2 Woodward books, Fear and Rage, and the Bolton book. There's been a lot of attention to what's said in North Korea about the North Korea policy there, and I suppose we'll get to that. But if you do what's called the Washington read, which I'm sure academics don't do, which is you go and you look up your name, or if your name isn't there, you look up the country you're interested in. If you look up South Korea in the indexes of any of those books, it comes up again and again and again. I mean, President Trump had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, I think, about South Korea, or at least some very strongly held ideas, which were, again, were not unique to South Korea, but especially strongly felt there about South Korea being a freeloader, not understanding why we were there, and this came out with in terms of I think a very bumpy relationship on the traditional alliance issues with South Korea, exacerbated, of course, by the growing tensions with China and the very transactional approach that Trump has taken to all alliances, but with South Korea kind of in the I guess the front row when it came to things like military burden sharing and the question of military troops, at least within the Asian context. But given all that, there also Trump was seen, and certainly by the Moon administration, and for a good part of his term, as a potentially transformational figure on the Korean Peninsula when it came to North Korea. And so I think that certainly the Moon administration was very eager to work with him on that, to as closely as possible to encourage him in that, despite the tensions in other parts of the relationship. And as I mentioned, I think John Delury would have more to say about this. I think that there was a great hope, even among those in the South Korean political scene who might be more skeptical of this kind of unconventional approach. But the other thing I'd say, and I know this is all kind of background, is I also get the sense that just since this pandemic, this notion in South Korea that somehow the U.S. has kind of lost its way a bit. Again, this may not be unique to South Korea, but I've certainly felt it from my Korean friends there. Has also affected the way it's looking at what is still unfolding in the United States. And as we prepare for a more conventional, normal Biden presidency, the fact that South Korea and the US had their first diagnosed COVID case on the same day and then went and diametrically opposed directions in terms of the approach to it and its success, I would say, and relative success or lack or failure in dealing with it. And of course, we're still in the midst of that. So I think it has introduced a rather deep note of doubt among the I would say oftentimes the ever positive South Koreans about hoping that the U.S. will continue to play an important leadership role in East Asia and the world. So since the Biden victory has been declared, if not yet, as John mentioned, acknowledged by Mr. Trump himself yet. There's been a couple of things that are probably worth noting. One, and this is just even before the election, then candidate Biden published an op-ed or a column under his name in Yonhap, the news service in South Korea, that underscored the importance of the Korean American community, which is something we do in our politics more now when it comes to foreign policy, but also it's his commitment to a sort of more, I would say, conventional and normal, and those are good words, and I think in South Korea for them to approach to the alliance in the 70th year after the start of the Korean War. After the election was declared, it was much noted in South Korea that President-elect and Mrs. Biden went to the Korean War Memorial in Delaware on November 11th. Maybe that was just the war memorial that happened to be closest to them. I don't know, but it was certainly, I think, noted and welcomed in South Korea. And of course, we've had the first Biden-Moon telephone conversation with a fairly detailed outbrief from the Korean side of what was said, the fact that it came after the phone call to the Japanese prime minister, but that it was lengthy and friendly and included, according to the Blue House readout, a promise of a visit together in person very soon. So I think all this is very welcome in South Korea. I think there's a sense, and I would agree with it, that that President Biden will move quickly to settle the irritant of the unresolved issue of the burden sharing agreement called the Special Measures Agreement in South Korea, which was really pretty much close to agreement during the Trump administration, but as in many things, I mean, kind of set aside at the last minute by President Trump, who felt there was still, he still wanted more. So I think that will be settled fairly quickly. Some of the other issues related to the alliance of assurance of American reliability, extended deterrence, commitment to adjustments in the troops, SOPCON transfers, another thing for those of you who follow South Korean affairs. I think all that will, in a way, go smoothly. And I think that when South Korea looks at Biden's expressed sort of priorities in foreign policy, there's much there that's welcome. I mean, number one is strengthening relations with alliances, a lot of reassurances. Another is multilateral engagement, the return to a variety of multilateral fora, again, very, very welcome by a middle power like South Korea, which really is trying to become more of a leader in many of those organizations as well. The G20, which of course was very important to South Korea and kind of taking its place at the top table after the 2008 financial crisis. Democracy promotion. There's a talk that Biden will convoke a summit of democracies. And again, this plays, I think, to the fact that the Koreans have really bought into the notion of a values alliance, even as during the Trump administration, the US kind of walked away from it a bit. All that will be very welcome. But with that, I think will also come a little bit of worry of an understanding that there's a lot of work to do, and Biden may have more asks of South Korea. He may care more about what South Korea does on some things than Trump did. And so there'll be some pressure on it as well. And that, of course, brings us to two things. One, the US-China relationship now handled, sense that South Korea feels now more than ever kind of squeezed between the US and China. A lot of interesting reporting I noticed, not only in the South Korean press, but in the US press, about the conclusion of the RCEP agreement in the trade area just over the weekend, with Korea and Korea not in the CPTPP, but a lot of questions about where Biden will go on. Although what I'm hearing, and I have to say I'm not hearing much, getting into a multilateral trade arrangement is probably something that's going to take the Biden administration a little bit of time, given everything else it has on its plate. Which takes me out to where I'm going to turn it over to John Delury, and that is, of course, then North Korea policy. Another issue where I think the kind of conventional thing one hears from a lot of South Koreans, regardless of their own ideological sort of lineup, is Biden is just not going to have enough time for North Korea. He's not going to pay enough attention to it. So, you know, if you have a view that engagement needs to go forward, there's certainly a concern there that whatever momentum, whatever possibilities were opened up, even by the failed, if you like, Trump summitry, that momentum could be lost and we could go backwards. And I think we get to a theme we hear, and then to circle all the way back to my kind of historical start. Every time a new president comes to office, one of the big questions I think for South Koreans is, are they going to pay enough attention to us? And I think that, reflects just a sense of a smaller country looking to its most important ally. But when it comes to North Korea, that's something that one hears quite a bit.
Thank you very much. That's going to give us, I think, a lot of food for thought. Let's move very swiftly to John for the perspective that takes into account the view from North Korea.
Okay, thank you, John. And Kathy, it's so much fun to be in this group with you. So I'll try to be brief and make kind of three overarching points, and then we can circle back on things. I guess the first thing I would say, trying to look at this, the nice thing, since we can't engage the North Koreans, is people like me can speak for them, and who's going to correct me here in Pyongyang. But my best sense of sort of what's at stake for Kim Jong-un, and has been, to step back quickly, I focus on 2018. I think 2018 is the year that showed us his real ambitions and where he really wants to lead North Korea. And we could debate that, but that's my view. And the big shift that he was attempting was to move, as he had signaled from the moment after his father died, essentially, was to make the shift from kind of the North Korea we know, which is a very militant system focused on control and with very hostile relations in the neighborhood, to shift that to a different kind of North Korea, a more normal North Korea, still authoritarian, still one-party state under Kim family rule, but focused on economic development. So quite similar to a pattern that all of us know very well, actually not that different from the pattern Kathy saw in 1976 here in South Korea, of a developmental dictatorship, as some call it. And along with that came a realignment of foreign relations for North Korea. And so the breakthroughs with the United States and with South Korea, in my view, of 2018 were real. And they showed us the plan A that Kim Jong-un wanted to pursue. I think it was with you, John, in one of the track twos, that it's one of these things now, it's probably going to haunt me. I called it a diplomatic revolution. That was probably something you could say in September 2018. But I'll defend myself citing Hannah Arendt, whose book On Revolution is one of my go-tos. And she talks about revolutions like the French that end in Napoleon, and the good revolutions like the Americans, if it can survive this, that create a new order. And Hanoi was basically the failure of the diplomatic revolution to create a new order, a realignment that could stick. And so what I think we've seen since February 2019, since the failure in Hanoi, is what Bill Urey, who I've learned a lot from in talking about some of this along the way, what he calls the BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement, or Plan B. I think this is Kim Jong-un's Plan B, not his Plan A. And he's figuring out how to navigate a Plan B kind of scenario. So that brings me to the second point, which is to look now to kind of fast forward us to this moment, and the question that I keep hearing that seems to be on most people's minds. One of them, Kathy addressed at the end there, is what will Biden do? The other question is, what will Kim do? And so it's kind of, will Biden hold a summit, and will Kim test a ICBM, and when? It's almost like a race. Who will do it first? So my view on that is that Kim Jong-un can be persuaded to give some time. And again, that's because I think this is not, he's going to be looking for a way to get back to Plan A with Biden administration. That's my operating premise. And I actually see indicators in North Korean statements, pretty consistent ones, that go back to Hanoi, where they keep coming back, Kim Jong-un himself, and then all the, the top, his sister and all of them hit this point about, they praise the relationship with Trump, and that's usually all that our media talks about. And then they go on to say, but that's just the personal relationship between our two leaders. That does not change the fundamental relationship between our two countries, which remains hostile. You Americans are hostile to us. And that's what has to change, the hostile policy. So I think at least if Kim Jong-un can rationally analyze the situation, he would see the Biden administration as an opportunity to actually, it won't necessarily work, but it presents a much better opportunity to actually address the real issue, which is changing the bilateral relationship, than say 4 more years of the Trump administration, which by February 2019 had reached its limits. You could have a personal relationship with Trump, you could have the theater of that, and they would go for that, but you weren't changing the US-DPRK relationship. And Biden presents an opportunity, or the Biden administration represents an opportunity to do that. The other reason I'm hopeful that that Kim can be persuaded to give some time is in surveying, and recently I've been working on an article just looking over North Korea the course of the year. They're very internally focused, and Kim Jong-un in particular is very internally focused. We actually just saw this in today's news yesterday, I think it was. There was a Politburo meeting, and Kim Jong-un is not talking about the United States or Biden. I mean, maybe he said something, but that's not the reports. He's not talking about South Korea. He's talking about corruption. He's talking about COVID, some problem we're trying to figure out, at the Pyongyang University of Medicine. And that is typical of this year. Consistently, he gets the Politburo together a lot, and he reads the Riot Act on one issue or another. It's mostly COVID or the economy domestically. And so he's quite internally focused. There were some missile tests in March and April, but not much. And he's been actually quite restrained. He has declared his moratorium, self-imposed unilateral test moratorium, is over. So that's not good. He said it's over at the end of last year, but he hasn't really acted on that. And so this comes to my third and final point, I think echoing some points that Kathy made in terms of, from my reading of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, what does that mean for the Biden administration? In my view, the team and Biden himself, however they want to do it, they need to send signals really soon. I certainly understand, as a US citizen, I fully understand how low a priority North Korea is. And I wouldn't argue it should be a priority. There's so much to do. But still, obviously, you can't completely ignore North Korea. And they have it within their bandwidth to send a signal soon to just give Kim Jong-un the reason to allow that time. And then we'll have to see. We'll get into phase 2. And I think the way to do that is, as soon as it's possible, to announce a policy review process. I've been kind of checking on this, and maybe Kathy can help us. From what I saw, the Bush administration, when they came in, they did a policy review, and I gather they released it in June. So they took a while. I think June's a little too late. You got to move faster than that. To my knowledge, and Kathy, correct this if it's wrong, the Obama administration did not do a policy review. I remember some advocating that they needed to have a policy review, that formal process was kind of missing. The Trump administration did a policy review. They released it in April, and that was where we got still probably the best description of the policy: maximum pressure and engagement. And that was out by April. So I think that the Biden team should, the last thing I'd say is not only announce they're going to do a policy review, but model it on a slightly different one, the Perry process. I even have my person picked out, not that anyone's asking me. I think General Vince Brooks would be a phenomenal person to do this, but modeled on Secretary of Defense Bill Perry's process, which came late in the Clinton administration. Again, Kathy knows a lot more about this than I would, but that would actually include the North Koreans in the review. And so you slip in a resumption of dialogue as part of your review process. in this semi-outside, but really, sort of space of we want to look at where we are and think how to move forward. And we want to include everyone, including the key parties, including the North Koreans, in the review process itself. And then you're at least over that first hump of will the Biden administration talk or not? You're already talking. Okay, so I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
John, thank you very much. And thank you for giving us some concrete proposals that the incoming administration should look at. Let me just sort of pitch questions to both of you, if I may, and one individual questions as well as one joint question. John, on your question of your point of the North Korean administration focusing inwards, to what extent do you feel that there is a constraint in terms of the electoral calendar, the timetable in South Korea? President Moon is now, of course, in some respects, given the term limit, approaching lame duck status. From Pyongyang's perspective, how much of that is a constraint? How much urgency is there in Pyongyang, not only to take advantage of the incoming new administration in the United States, but also to capitalize on that role that South Korea has played? And then linked to Kathy's point about the sort of growing sense, at least until recently in the United States, in South Korea, that the United States has lost its way. Is there any discernible shift in the South that there is, I wouldn't describe it in revolutionary terms in the way that John did, but perhaps is there a sense that South Koreans now feel more of a sense of agency and need to be more masters of their own destiny? We saw the South Korean ambassador to the United States talk about how the last 70 years of the relationship framed by the Korean War between the United States and Korea has been a critical part of South Korea's political evolution, but that the next 70 years won't necessarily head in the same direction. That seemed like quite an unusual statement for an ambassador to make, and the response on the part of the South Korean foreign minister seemed quite swift and critical. But I wonder whether that reflects a shift in terms of the attitudes of both the older and the younger generation in South Korea to look at new opportunities, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or in relationships with China, or through not just the G20 process, but the G7 process, where, of course, President Trump has suggested that South Korea now can play an instrumental role. And then a final question to both of you, prompted again by John's final set of recommendations. How much should we be paying attention to personalities in Washington when it comes to the significant offices of state, whether it's Secretary of State or National Security Advisor? Are these personnel choices going to have any impact in any meaningful way in terms of what a Biden administration might do in terms of its relations with both the North and the South? So, I mean, John, maybe if we could start with you and then move on to Kathy.
I'm glad I got the easier question of those two. I look forward to Kathy's answer to your second question. But that's a great question, John. And there's been a fair bit of discussion about, why didn't Kim Jong-un tease out Moon Jae-in more? Why not try to get more goodies out of a liberal who has wanted to do some, sunshine policy 2.0. As far as I'm not sure I see the lame duck. The feeling here right now is not lame duck feeling. The coronavirus is so intense, and Moon's pretty much seen as quite competent in that, and so there's that may be affecting the political timeline a bit. Also, who knows? But the money would be on Moon's successor winning at this point. The conservatives did not do well in the National Assembly elections in April, and they don't have an obvious strong candidate, and there are a few on the liberal side. So from that perspective as well, if North Korean analysts would, when asked, would probably say, well, even if he is, we're probably going to get some more similar to Moon in the Blue House. So we don't have to calculate on that too much. The key thing I would say, and actually I can answer the third question, give some thoughts to that as well. Where I can see Moon Jae-in playing a key role now, and or certainly early enough that the lame duck factor wouldn't be a major one, is in the connection with Biden. And and that's where I think personalities matter. I am hopeful that when they meet, Joe Biden and Moon Jae-in can have a kind of mind meld and really get on the same page and really understand where they're coming from. I can see Joe Biden listening to Moon Jae-in on inter-Korean issues with an openness. Barack Obama listened to Lee Myung-bak, and I think that shaped the policy. And of course, now South Korea is in a different place, and Moon has a very different view than Lee Myung-bak. So I think that the Biden personality itself, if when connected with Moon Jae-in, could do something. And that could create a very different dynamic vis-a-vis the inter-Korean piece. Because although, say, in 2018, the policies were aligned, Trump and Moon obviously were never close, clearly. And Trump never empowered Moon. Biden, I could see actually empowering Moon, in part because of the problem we've identified, the bandwidth problem. If Moon can bridge some gaps, can get in there and negotiate, then that'd be great. Now, that would mean trust. And that means Biden's going to have to give Moon room he didn't have before to actually offer some things. So that would be kind of some initial thoughts. I guess the last thing on personalities and the team, regardless of who's state and who's NSC and all these things, those things will matter. But the biggest difference we're going to see is teamwork. I mean, I expect that the Biden administration is going to have really good teamwork. And we know, you mentioned some of the books, including from the former national security advisor, talk about the last thing you would associate with the Trump administration is teamwork. And that dysfunctionality, when you have John Bolton coordinating an engagement with North Korea, that if you're a North Korean, how do you work with that, right? So I think that the coherence and the teamwork that the Biden administration will bring in will allow for, again, it goes back to the point of actually changing some elements in the bilateral relationship as opposed to just a personality thing.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. Kathy?
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with John on the personality question, and the only kind of personal relationship I would focus on initially would be the Biden-Moon one. And I'm hopeful about that. I think that the cautionary note would be, again, going back into earlier administrations, when George W. Bush came to power, it was the height of the Sunshine Era, and Kim Dae-jung was, the senior statesman, respected president of Korea, pursuing Sunshine, insisted on having, really pushed for a very early meeting with George W. Bush when this policy review had not been completed. And again, according to all the memoirs now published, basically kind of lectured the new president on the Sunshine Policy and why it should be continued. And it didn't go well. So every time is different. But I guess, no one's asked me for my advice. But I mean, what I would hope is that that President Moon would approach this in terms of, understanding the view from Washington, everything that's on the plate, coming with a sense of confidence about what the Republic of Korea, South Korea brings to the table, and all these multilateral fora I've mentioned, public health, climate change, nonproliferation, Middle East. There's so many areas where, and this is not just sort of happy talk, where South Korea has real standing, and its standing has grown in this pandemic because of the strength of its institutions, because of K-pop, maybe, it's just in a different place. It can do a lot. I think they can build the relationship on that. And I think that Biden's desire to demonstrate that he has strengthened the alliance will make him open to thinking about how to work with Moon. So I agree that relationship is very important. But it's not a guarantee that these two men who seem, somewhat to have more congenial personalities vis-a-vis each other will inevitably agree. They've got to, and if I can just add to that on the policy review, policy review is it's like, let's form a committee to study it. It always makes people a little nervous too. I mean, I agree. There's going to be a policy review. That's what new administrations do. And getting back to who comes into the administration, clearly, I mean, a lot of people are going to come to this administration who were in the Obama administration. So they come with their own, just as I do, with my own sense of this is what happened on my watch. These are the lessons I learned from it, which may or may not be useful, right? But they'll come in with that. But I think they'll also come in with a sense that, again, the relationship with Seoul is very, very important. But there's going to be some asks vis-a-vis China. So how that's handled will also be very, 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 very important. The only other point I wanted to make on that was, rather than talk about personalities, to talk a little bit about American domestic politics. We seem to be, although nothing is concluded yet in terms of the remaining seats in the U.S. Senate. The likelihood is probably that we're going to have a Democratic president and a Republican Senate. North Korea has seen this play before. It was called Clinton after the midterms, after the agreed framework was agreed, when everything Clinton tried to do to engage with North Korea was shot down by the Republican Senate. So I think one big question in terms of North Korea policy is, after the upheaval of the Trump years, or the innovation of the Trump years, are the Republicans going to return to the kind of the status quo ante of coming down very hard on any Democratic president's effort to engage with North Korea, or has the paradigm shifted as a bit? Has the aperture opened? I mean, I think it would be logical. It's the latter. The taboo of a summit with a North Korean leader has been broken big time. The quasi taboo of linking South Korean U.S. military exercises to actions by North Korea has been broken. That may present some opportunities, but and also I would say, even though the Hanoi summit failed, the Trump administration had in their point man on North Korea, Mr. Began, someone who explicitly and publicly said, we need to go to a step-by-step approach. Again, that used to be anathema to the Republicans. If a Democratic president tries it, which I think he probably realistically will, well, that's the approach you have to take. Will they be more accommodating? I mean, those are questions about American politics I am supremely unqualified to answer, but I think that will have as big an effect as personalities.
Let me get to the questions now from our audience, because we have quite a few. One topic that keeps coming up is China, and you mentioned China, Kathy, in your earlier remarks. Colin Crooks, the British ambassador to Pyongyang, currently outside Pyongyang for obvious reasons, asks what priority the new administration will give to the DPRK as part of its dealings with China. So that's, I'm afraid, another American-focused question. But also there are questions from Nina Crickle-Choi and also Oscar Pietrovitz, really about the view from South Korea about how best to manage relations with China. Is this going to be a point of divergence between Seoul and Washington? So maybe starting with John and then coming back to Kathy.
Okay, well, familiar names there. Hello, Ambassador Crooks. I actually worry about this issue in terms of how the Biden folks approach China and the North Korea piece. I mean, again, my view, which is maybe a little contrarian, is that, that's a very tense relationship, the alliance relationship between China and North Korea. If you go back to 2016, 2017, not that long ago, all the cracks in that alliance were, not all of them, but they were coming out into public view. It was quite extraordinary how bad that relationship got. And again, what I think we saw in 2018 was Kim Jong-un seeing the opening to move in the direction of the United States and China and South Korea. And part of that is a strategy to deal with the overwhelming influence of a neighbor and ally that he's quite wary of. And that's typical of everyone in East Asia. Everyone's doing that in some way. And so what concerns me is when I hear the kind of Biden world going back to the playbook of, we got to go to Beijing, and if they're tough on North Korea, then we can, kind of get what we want. And, I would discount that on both ends. First of all, sanctions have a very poor record of really changing North Korea's calculus. And so I think that the pressure and punitive approach really doesn't get you what you want in terms of denuclearization. But secondly, at a strategic level, I mean, unless you're playing three-dimensional chess to create even more tension in that relationship, if you're sincerely going to China and saying, please help us by putting pressure on North Korea, and here we'll trade you other things, I think you're making a big mistake. You're basically giving up pieces of the US-China relationship unnecessarily to get something that's useless vis-a-vis North Korea. And if you're going to get real change out of the North Koreans, it's because you're going to sit down with them and they want a different relationship with the United States and the security and economic things that come with that. And you have to figure out how to negotiate it with them. You actually don't want the Chinese at the table. And so I hope that that Team Biden at least considers that hypothesis and doesn't fall back on the default of, let's get Beijing to be tough and then that's the method to deal with North Korea. I'll leave the other parts to Kathy.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think it's given the current state of US-China relations and the current state of, I guess, sanctions enforcement in the midst of on North Korea, that the Biden administration going to Beijing and say first order business is tighten sanctions is probably not going to be very effective. I do think that the Biden administration understands well that there's not going to be progress on the Korean Peninsula with absent some involvement by China. And I do think that the hope of the Biden administration will be, and this is rather different from the Trump approach, that will be that given all the areas where we're competing, we have conflict with China, that North Korea can and should be an area where we can cooperate. And I think there will be more of an openness to trying to think about so not a return to the six-party talks, but what a more multilateral kind of approach would look like. So I think that will be part of the policy review. Actually during the Trump administration, although it was obviously very much based on this Trumpian, unilateral or bilateral approach with Pyongyang itself. In fact, I mean, the deal, if you like, or the de facto deal they came out with was originally a Chinese proposal. Maybe I shouldn't say that, right? It was a freeze for a freeze. It was a stopping of testing, de facto stopping of testing in the north, and a suspension of what President Trump unfortunately called, without consulting anybody, provocative war games in the south. But anyway, the issue of exercises, which I know has also been raised. So I think that will be something that the Biden administration will have to look at. On the other question, will China be a point of divergence for South Korea and the U.S.? I think that is the big worry in Seoul. And I think that is the big diplomatic challenge for the Biden administration as it formulates its foreign policy. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, and when it thinks about China policy, what I understand is, the first thing on their list is strengthening alliances. I mean, and Biden talked a lot about this during the campaign. If China is one of the major or the major strategic challenge for the United States, however one defines that right now, we need our allies. And then, multilateralism and so on, and said values promotion, that's their agenda. So there's a lot there to cooperate on, but South Korea has equities too. And the US, I think what you found, if we pose it as, my way or the highway, you're with us or you're against us, or buys into the notion, which one does here in parts of Asia, that somehow South Korea is already kind of a lost cause in terms of being, sucked into the new Chinese world order. There's going to be a lot of tension. So that's an area, I guess, where, both I'm worried and I think it's extremely important in the diplomacy going forward.
Thank you, Kathy. We've just got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I'm going to pitch, if I may, a group of questions to both of you so that our audience will feel that their points have been addressed. Zooming out from the broader question of North Korea, Southeast Asia and regional diplomacy, we have 2 questions. One from Marianne Perron-Doise, who's interested in the question of the Indo-Pacific strategy and South Korea's southern policy, and also another question from Philip Howard, picking up the point about RCEP. So in Southeast Asia, how much autonomy should we expect South Korea to play? And what will be the response of the Biden administration to that? When we talk about alliance relations, the question of Japan remains uppermost, of course, and David Warren, another in this case, former ambassador, British ambassador to Tokyo, asks about the role of the United States in trying to bridge the differences between Seoul and Tokyo. And then circling back to the question of North Korea, we have one question from Betty Sue about the question of human rights and how that will feature in the new administration. And finally, a couple of questions which really go back to the issue of bandwidth. Given the range of foreign policy issues that the Biden administration is going to confront, James Hammond and also Nobuyasu Abe in Tokyo are both asking the question, will the new president simply have enough capacity to really focus on the North Korean question? So Southeast Asia, alliance relations with Japan, human rights, and the question of capacity. A lot to take on board, and we've only got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so 2 minutes each on some or all of those issues, if you can handle them. John.
Okay, I'll do my best. Gosh, on Japan, and we should hear you, John. You're the better expert here. I mean, I will say this is one where I'm sort of holding my breath and kind of dreading what comes because, having been here in South Korea lived here for 10 years now and watched efforts under the Obama administration to really bring the two together, and do that, which in my view, from a kind of South Korean public view, ended up being deeply counterproductive. The deal of December 2015 was deeply counterproductive. But I hear kind of Obama folks who I could see ending up Biden folks thinking that was a good model. And if they could get back to that, and that Trump failed by not making the effort at the trilateral. So I worry a lot. It's so hard to understand from the inside somewhat the dynamics between South Korea and Japan. And frankly, I rarely feel I find Americans who do. And I'm sure I don't understand the Japanese view of it, but I do think I have a sense of the South Korean view. And so I worry that the attempts are counterproductive. So maybe one of you has a better solution. I just worry. And it's a very good point about human rights. That's one where, basically when it came to human rights in general, Donald Trump didn't care very much. And it was a non-issue in all the stuff we saw with North Korea. And, it's hard to imagine Joe Biden or a Biden administration similarly just sloughing that off and discounting it. And so that I would say is something, again, I would kind of put that on the list to echo. Kathy made such great points about not getting too excited about Biden and Moon. This would also go on her list of how is Moon Jae-in, who has great credibility as a human rights champion within South Korea, but doesn't talk about it vis-a-vis North Korea. And how is he going to work that diplomacy and figure out a way to move, a liberal engagement strategy jointly between the United States and South Korea forward that addresses the human rights concerns that are serious and will be deeply felt by a Biden administration in a way that they weren't. He didn't have to worry about that with the Trump administration. So again, I have no solution, but it's a great question to put it on the radar. I think I better stop. That felt like 2 minutes. Should we?
Thank you, John. I'm sorry we have so little time. There's so much to think about. Kathy, you're going to have the last word, I think.
Right. Well, I've been too long-winded, so I'll try to do lightning round here. Human rights, I think that the Biden administration will nominate someone to be the special coordinator for human rights, humanitarian affairs in North Korea, a congressionally mandated position at the State Department, which like many positions in the Trump administration was not filled. And yes, that will be something to also manage in the context of whatever engagement we have with North Korea, as well as concerns that South Korea might have. I agree that the Biden administration, they will, these are institutionalists. They will try to play a role in bridging the Japan-South Korean gap. The effort will be made, I believe. The Indo-Pacific and Asian architecture, RCEP, all of that. I think it's a huge question for the new administration. It's not a new one, but it is a point of, as I think I've already mentioned, of possible tension between Seoul and Washington. I think that from a South Korean perspective, the more it can be ad hoc groupings around specific issues that are sensitive to South Korean concerns, but also play, and this would be true of other allies, play to South Korean strengths. There's a lot that can be done that's very doable. South Korea, for its own reasons, of course, has been diversifying and trying to not decouple, of course, from China, but trying to diversify its supply chains and everything else. And so I think there's ground for cooperation there if it's not handled as it is an us or them or a ganging up on China thing. And also a sense, I've heard this from South Korea, and sorry, I'm going too long, that what if China does start punishing South Korea again, or as it's doing Australia, where are people on that? What do you do? There's not a great answer to that, but it's a question that's going to be raised. And finally, bandwidth. Yeah, Korea, China, Asia, those of us who've been involved in Asia for a while think, when from the US, the gravity shifting towards Asia, transatlantic ties obviously remain very important and so on. But I think that, within the context of broader US interests, yes, there'll be time for Asia, certainly. And I think there has to be time for North Korea. There's enough bandwidth.
Well, that's a very optimistic note on which to end. And sort of reaffirming the points that you were making in setting out the opportunities that the new administration presents, not underestimating the real challenges. This has been a great discussion. I'm sorry that we couldn't go on longer. There's a lot more that we could have talked about. To our audience, I hope that some of your questions, or most of them, were addressed. At some point, it would be great to welcome our two speakers back. But for now, let me thank you for illuminating what remains a perennial and challenging situation. And we look forward to hosting more webinars in the future. But for now, stay safe. And we will continue to watch affairs on the Peninsula and in Washington with our usual level of interest. But thanks to you all, and thanks to our two speakers.